Hey guys, okay, so today we're going to be talking about Japan. Okay, so let's get started. So in early Japan, prior to 400 CE, clans mostly controlled it. It was all these different clans all throughout the various islands that was Japan. So Japan's isolation gave rise to this unique Japanese religion we're going to be talking about known as Shintoism. Okay, so Shintoism's a religion based on the respect of nature and really believing in that worship of ancestors. And Shinto worshippers also believe in these divine spirits known as the kami that live within nature. Here's some pictures I've got of it. So the most important god that you need to know in Shintoism is this god named Amaterasu, which is the sun goddess who gave light to the world. So in Japan, so you had these different Chinese and Korean merchants who brought Buddhism to Japan. And Japan accepted Buddhism as their official religion by the imperial court around the mid-700s. And Japan's going to combine Shinto and Buddhist beliefs to form their own unique version of Buddhism. So a lot of this was also built off of a strong Chinese influence in the 7th to the 9th centuries. And China is going to show their use of dynasties in that dynastic cycle. Japan's going to think it's really interesting, so they're going to adapt their own version of dynasties. They're also going to be influenced by Chinese styles of writing, architecture, and art. We're going to look at some of those examples. So Chinese art and Japanese art, pretty similar looking. The way that it was done using the same form of calligraphy is pretty similar, just maybe a few differences. You don't see as much color necessary in Japanese art as Chinese art, but otherwise they look pretty comparable. The same thing goes for Chinese and Japanese writing. So the style of using this beautiful form of writing is completely different as far as like there's more symbols going on within Chinese, whereas in Japanese it's a little bit more of a freehand. Okay, and then you also have Chinese architecture, Japanese architecture, which again looks pretty similar. Chinese architecture is going to have this swooping thing, and it's usually about one story. Just watch what's that movie with the panda, Kung Fu Panda, and that'll give you a good clue there. Japanese architecture is a little bit more stacked, so it'd be kind of like one Chinese building stacked on top of each other, multiple layers. Okay, so one major thing about Japanese culture was this idea of Japanese feudalism. So we've talked about the word feudalism before when we were talking about the Middle Ages and European feudalism, where you had this system of hierarchy. It's very similar to the caste system when we talked about with Hinduism, and it's basically the social structure of society. So in Japan, this decentralization led to this feudal system. So on the bottom you had levels like farmers, merchants, peasants, and then these farmers traded lands to these strong warlords who were known as the daimyo that offered protection. So the daimyo were these loyal warriors that served over the samurai. And basically the comparison I would make, compare daimyo to the lords back when we talked about European feudalism, and then the samurai are very similar to the knights in that they were fighting for the daimyo. And so the daimyo are going to be under the emperor, and the emperor is going to be a pretty symbolic thing. Think of it kind of like the Queen of England, where she's in charge, but it's really the prime minister in charge. That's how it worked with the daimyo. So a little bit more on the samurai, just because it's a fun topic. So these samurai warriors were usually relatives or dependents of the daimyo. So not only were they working under them, usually there was some sort of relation, but there were some that were just hired warriors. But a lot of them were somewhat related to that daimyo they were serving for. So samurai warriors lived by this code that you definitely want to remember, known as the Bushido, which means courage, loyalty, fairness, and honor. And it's also what got regular people to respect the military, because they saw the military, which in Japan was the samurai, as these people who were really focused on loyalty, on courage, and they said, wow, that's really cool. So that's why people have a lot of respect for the military today. And then the samurai were also these really skilled swordsmen. Again, you can watch any movies on the samurai, it'll tell you that. But they also used horses and guns, which made them a little bit more unique than other military groups in this area of that time. And that's going to come after the arrival of the Europeans. They're going to be trading with one another. So just a fun fact about Japan today. So if you look at the city of Tokyo, the capital of Japan, there's currently 9.3 million people living there. And that's about 35 million just in the metro alone, compared to Atlanta, which has 472,000 and 5.7 million in the metro. So think about all the traffic in Atlanta, just like quadruple that, and you got Tokyo. Just to give you kind of an average of how many people live in Japan. Okay, so another part of this Japanese feudalism, and these are going to be people who are on the same level as the daimyo, is these people known as the shogun. So both Japanese and European feudalism were portrayed by this decentralized government that you had a breakdown. But in Europe, you had the leader was the king. Well, in this one, we talked about how the emperor was just in name only. So someone had to have that leadership, kind of like the prime minister. And for Japan, that's going to be the shogun, who held this real power and ruled as a military-type dictator. So they're the one that's truly in control. And they're basically giving all the orders of how the land should be run. So, just a couple examples of some people. One leader, Oda Nobunaga, and again, if I mess up any of these words, I apologize. These are very difficult words to pronounce, but I just call him Oda. So Oda is going to start this movement to unite Japan, and he's going to try to seize the capital of Kyoto in 1568. But this isn't going to work, and eventually he's just going to commit suicide because one of his generals is going to turn on him. And if I'm guessing, he did it through that thing where they would take the sword and go to their stomach, and they would just, like, cut their stomach open. It's pretty gross. I'm not going to show it on here, but you can look it up. Okay, so one of the people who is going to successfully unite all of these different tribes and clans in Japan is this guy named Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he's going to create this thing known as the Tokugawa shogunate. So Tokugawa is going to unify Japan and become the shogun, which again, like we've been saying, it's that same thing where they're like the leader, and since the emperor is just symbolic, it's basically this guy who's in charge. So one thing he's going to do, he's going to create a feudal Japanese military government, really strengthen the government and make it more militaristic. And then the shoguns, just so you know, were of the Tokugawa clan, and this shogun in particular is going to rule for about 200 years in this Tokugawa clan family. Okay? And that's going to be known as this Tokugawa shogunate after he goes and unifies. And the Tokugawa shogunate is going to be known as this time of peace, prosperity, and isolation. So the Tokugawa clan is going to be control of the government, and they're just going to make it a really happy, peaceful time to live in Japan. So let's talk a little bit about Japanese isolation. So when this Tokugawa clan begins to take over, in the 16th century, you get the Portuguese arriving. And at first, the Japanese really welcomed the Europeans. They brought guns, cannons. They're like, oh, cool, they're bringing us stuff. And then you also had these different missionaries that brought Christianity. So they were like, okay, well, they're introducing their religion. Can't be much too wrong with that. But we had this little thing that happened about 1,000 years before this that we all just learned about, the Crusades, which were not exactly the most peaceful time when some Christian missionaries came over and messed up things. They tried to do the exact same thing, but in Japan. And let's see how that turns out. So, by about 1600, over 300,000 Japanese had converted to Christianity. And the leader at the time, that guy Tokugawa Ieyasu, who helped to unify Japan and start that Tokugawa shogunate, was really afraid that Christianity was going to change Japanese culture and that the people would rebel and go against just the ways of the Japanese. So he's going to actually ban Christianity and try to rid Japan of the Christians. And by 1639, Japan decided, you know what, not only are we going to stop these Christians from converting and probably doing exactly what they did in the Crusades, but we're also going to seal our borders. We're not going to let anyone come in. Nobody can mess with Japan. So they're going to seal the borders, and only the port of Nagasaki is going to remain open. And the Tokugawa merchants would only trade with Dutch and Chinese. So not only have they isolated themselves, they're only going to trade with the Dutch and Chinese. They're completely cutting off the rest of Europe. Despite this time of isolation, though, where, again, they're falling really behind, it's a time of real peace and prosperity. One thing, though, since they're not talking to other people, they get a little bit behind technology-wise, and that's really going to get shown, particularly when you had this guy named Matthew Perry come to visit and see what's going on in Japan, since they're starting to fall behind. He's going to come in 1853, which in 1853, it's the middle of the Industrial Revolution. We'll be talking about it a lot more next unit, but the world, for the most part, was starting to get really technologically advanced. But Japan wasn't, because they were so isolated. So Matthew Perry's going to come and visit Japan just to see what's going on. And he noticed that it was where people were forbidden to leave. Not only was it like you were isolated, you weren't allowed to leave. And he was quoted as saying, the Japanese were so isolated and behind technologically that they had never seen steamships before, and called them giant dragons puffing smoke, because they had no idea what a ship was, because they had fallen that far behind. One thing they did have, and this is more of just a fun fact, they had this thing known as the Kabuki Theater. Make sure you know what this is. But these were these dances and dramas where in the 1600s they had these female performers, but it was seen as a kind of a form of prostitution. So they decided to ban it in 1629 and have only male performers because they didn't want women up there, you know, being a little bit too scandalous. But this was their form of entertainment. And when Matthew Perry came to see it, he thought, like, that is really weird. No women would ever do that in the 1850s in Europe or like in the Americas, which was like more advanced, but at the same time wouldn't show this type of thing going on. So again, talking about their culture, it was a very big time of peace and prosperity, but you had just a lot of really things that people were falling behind on, and these are things that they're not going to get caught up on until you get all the way to the World Wars in the 1900s. So Japan had a long way to come, and it's really hard to believe that now they're this big technological country that we think of it today. But that's all I've got for Japan. I'll see you guys next time. Talk about China.